Lately, something has shifted inside you, and the people around you have noticed. It wasn't something you announced. There was no confrontation, no speech, no long explanations. It happened in silence, in your gaze, in the absence of reaction. Where there used to be an effort to keep the peace, there is a different presence now, a lucidity that wasn't there before. And that makes people uncomfortable. Because when you stop justifying yourself, stop absorbing the tension in the room, stop carrying emotions that aren't yours, something essential shifts in the invisible dynamic between you and the other person. Carl Jung described this moment as a decisive turning point in the individuation process, when consciousness begins to integrate the shadow and a person stops living purely through adaptation. It's not coldness, it's not hardness, it's clarity, and clarity is unsettling to those who once benefited from your confusion. Today, you're going to understand why this silent transformation completely changes the psychological game, and why it frightens those who once held control over you. Before this shift, you were living in a constant state of adjustment. You adjusted your tone of voice, you adjusted your words, you even adjusted your own emotions so you wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. At some point, you learned that keeping the peace was more important than expressing the truth. And little by little, you began to confuse love with tolerating disrespect. You were the one who understood too much, who explained other people's behavior to yourself, who said, "He's just going through a hard time. She didn't mean it that way. Maybe I misunderstood." The doubt always landed on you. The guilt always found a home in you. In the language of analytical psychology, this is a form of unconscious identification with the caregiver or peacemaker persona. You took on the role of stabilizing the emotional environment. You absorbed tensions that weren't yours. You internalized projections that didn't belong to you. And without realizing it, you began carrying in your own body what others refused to confront within themselves. You made yourself smaller so others wouldn't feel threatened. You silenced your perceptions so you wouldn't seem too much. You ignored clear signs because trusting your own intuition would have meant facing an uncomfortable truth. And so the dynamic solidified. The more you doubted yourself, the safer someone else felt beside you. The more you took responsibility for the chaos, the less the other person had to face their own shadow. What looked like excessive sensitivity was, in fact, a sophisticated mechanism of psychic survival. But surviving is not the same as living. And at some point, something inside you began to realize that the cost of this constant adaptation had become far too high. It was precisely this pattern that Carl Jung began to observe repeatedly in his clinical practice. He realized that in many relationships marked by emotional imbalance, there was an invisible mechanism operating with almost mathematical precision. Projection. In Jungian psychology, projection is the process by which a person displaces unconscious contents, rejected aspects, denied impulses, unacknowledged vulnerabilities onto someone else. Instead of confronting their own shadow, they perceive it outside themselves. And often, they choose as the container someone with a high capacity for empathy. You were never too sensitive. You were perceptive. You picked up on micro-expressions, subtle shifts in energy, inconsistencies between words and behavior. But instead of trusting that perception, you were conditioned to reinterpret it as exaggeration. So when someone projected guilt, you felt guilty. When they projected anger, you felt responsible for calming it. When they projected inadequacy, you worked harder to compensate. Jung understood that people with a strong intuitive or empathic function often develop an advanced ability for pattern recognition. They don't just sense the emotional climate, they register it. Unconsciously, they build psychological maps of others, identifying cycles, repeated behaviors, promises that are never fulfilled, apologies that always follow the same script. But as long as this perception remains unconscious, it serves only to keep the system running. You use your sensitivity to anticipate conflict, prevent explosions, soften tensions. Your emotional intelligence becomes a tool for self-preservation, and also for maintaining the imbalance. What Jung emphasized is that no system built on projection can sustain itself once one side begins to become conscious. The dynamic depends on you continuing to doubt your own reading of reality. It depends on you accepting the narrative the other person constructs. And this is where something fundamental begins to shift. Because when perception is no longer denied but consciously acknowledged, projection loses its ground. What once felt like confusion begins to organize into a pattern. What seemed like chaos reveals its structure. And once you see the structure, you can no longer return to your former innocence. The turning point doesn't arrive with drama. There's no announcement, no explosion. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly. It's the moment you stop fighting what you've known all along. For a long time, you saw it. You saw the inconsistencies, the subtle the cycles repeating with slight variations, but always the same outcome. What was missing wasn't perception, it was the inner permission to trust it. Carl Jung referred to this as the integration of the shadow. It doesn't mean becoming aggressive, cold, or indifferent. It means recognizing that within you there is also legitimate anger, legitimate boundaries, a healthy instinct for self. It means accepting that saying no is not betrayal, it is differentiation. Before, your empathy flowed only outward. You understood the other person, justified them, held space for them. Now, that same empathy begins to turn inward. You start asking, and me, what do I feel? What do I need? What is being violated here? This is the shift that changes everything. Because when empathy is directed toward yourself, the entire dynamic reorganizes. You stop taking responsibility for other people's discomfort. You stop rushing to restore a harmony that only exists if you sacrifice yourself. You stop softening truths to protect fragile egos, and something curious happens. You become quieter, not because you're repressing anything, but because you no longer feel the need to convince. Before, you over-explained, over-defended, over-argued. Now, you observe this new quietness is deeply unsettling to those who depended on your reactivity. The absence of justification interrupts the cycle. The absence of guilt disrupts the game. Your calm in the face of manipulation dismantles the old script. To integrate the shadow is to recognize that you are not only conciliatory light, you are also discernment. You are firmness. You are boundaries. And boundaries are not aggression. Boundaries are clarity in action. From this point on, you can no longer pretend you don't see. You can no longer call disrespect a misunderstanding. You can no longer confuse intensity with love. The transformation begins when you stop betraying yourself to keep others comfortable. And once it begins, it does not reverse. When you stop absorbing, something inevitable happens. You begin to reflect. In Jungian psychology, projection only works as long as it finds a willing or unconscious enough container to carry it. As long as you doubted your own perception, accepted guilt that wasn't yours, and tried to repair damage you didn't cause, the system remained stable. You functioned as an emotional buffer, but once consciousness sets in, the buffer disappears, and what was once absorbed begins to return to its source. Jung described this phenomenon as a kind of mirror effect. When you integrate your own shadow, you stop being a porous surface and become a reflective one. Projection meets resistance, and in meeting resistance, it reveals its origin. This is deeply uncomfortable for someone who has built their identity around avoiding self-confrontation, because suddenly, what used to be discharged onto you no longer finds a place to land. The accusation returns. The distortion is exposed. The narrative begins to lose coherence. You don't have to accuse. You don't have to confront aggressively. Often, it's enough to remain lucid. Enough not to accept a distorted version of events. Enough not to rush in to relieve the tension someone else created. And that is exactly what creates unease. When someone looks at you now, they no longer see the person who absorbed their insecurity. They encounter a gaze that doesn't try to fix, justify, or rescue. They encounter someone who sees, and being seen is threatening to those who depend on concealment. Projection is an attempt to keep the shadow out of awareness. But when you stop playing the role of emotional depository, the other person is forced, even if unconsciously, to face what they've been avoiding. And many would rather flee, attack, or discredit you than recognize it. That's why the narrative often shifts. You're labeled cold, distant, difficult. But what changed wasn't your capacity to love. It was your willingness to carry what doesn't belong to you. The mirror effect is not revenge. It's psychological consequence. You're not doing anything against anyone. You're simply no longer doing something for them, protecting their illusions. And when illusions begin to crack, the reaction almost always reveals what was hidden all along. Imagine someone who spent years in a relationship where reality was constantly distorted. Small comments were reinterpreted. Promises were made with conviction and broken just as casually. Conversations ended with that strange feeling that something was off. But it was never possible to pinpoint exactly what. This person began to doubt their own memory. Did I misunderstand? Am I overreacting? After every cycle of tension came a phase of intense reconciliation. Loving words, grand gestures, deep declarations, and then, once again, the rupture, the withdrawal, the reversal of blame. For a long time, everything felt chaotic, unpredictable, emotionally unstable, until something shifted, without telling anyone. This person began to document, not to confront, not to prove a point, but to confirm to themselves that they weren't losing their mind. Dates, exact phrases, the sequence of events, what was promised, what was later denied. Months later, rereading those notes, what once felt like disorder revealed a pattern. The same conflict resurfaced with slight variations. The same justification appeared whenever responsibility needed to be avoided. The apology followed almost the same script. The phase of intense affection always came after an episode of disrespect. What looked like chaos was, in fact, a predictable cycle, and that is the breaking point. When you recognize the pattern, something inside you real. Emotion loses part of its hypnotic pull. Intensity no longer feels like depth. Drama no longer feels like love. You begin to see the invisible structure sustaining the dynamic. It wasn't unpredictability. It was repetition. It wasn't genuine vulnerability. It was an unconscious strategy of control. This clarity doesn't arrive as immediate anger. It arrives as lucid silence, as an inner distance that allows you to observe instead of react, and from that moment on, the cycle begins to fail. When the tension returns, you already recognize the script. When the blame-shifting attempt appears, you identify the mechanism. When the apology comes wrapped in the same vague promises, you notice the absence of real change. You no longer need to argue to defend your perception. You simply know, and knowing completely alters the emotional field, because what kept the system running was your hope that this time would be different. When that blind hope transforms into conscious discernment, the cycle loses its power, not because the other person changed, but because you stopped participating in the repetition. When the pattern stops working, the system reacts, and that reaction almost always follows a predictable sequence, not because there's a conscious plan, but because dynamics rooted in control tend to unfold in stages. The first is confusion. The person genuinely doesn't understand what changed. The same strategies that once produced guilt, explanations, and reconciliation now meet silence. They test small provocations, subtle comments, attempts to reactivate the old script, but the response doesn't come the way it used to. The second stage is irritation, or even open anger. If guilt no longer works, intimidation might. The tone shifts. Accusations emerge. You've changed. You're overreacting. You were never like this. The intention, conscious or not, is to destabilize your new internal position. When that fails too, the third stage begins, negotiation. Promises of change appear urgently. Declarations of deep understanding. Proposals to start over. This is where the former version of you used to give in, because the possibility of transformation felt like legitimate hope. But now you recognize the moment. You recognize that promises are not change, that intensity is not depth, that verbal remorse is not true integration of the shadow. If negotiation doesn't restore control, the fourth stage emerges, controlling the narrative, indirect comments to others, rewritten versions of the story. You're described as cold, ungrateful, unstable. If they can't control you, they try to control how you're perceived. And finally, the fifth stage, the strategic return. Unexpected messages, manufactured crises, nostalgic memories reactivated, carefully positioned emotional appeals. The objective is simple: to reignite the emotional bond that sustained the cycle. The difference now is decisive. You see the stages as parts of a mechanism, not as isolated events, not as proof of love, not as signs of change. And when you don't react, don't over-explain, don't compulsively defend yourself, the cycle doesn't complete. What was once an invisible game becomes transparent, and transparency is unbearable for those who depended on your confusion. It is at this point that something deeper begins to solidify. It's no longer just about recognizing external patterns. It's about an internal reorganization of the personality. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the gradual movement by which a person stops living solely through adaptive roles and begins integrating the rejected parts of themselves. It is not a comfortable process. On the contrary, it requires you to face aspects you once preferred to soften: your legitimate anger, your need for boundaries, your ability to say no without guilt. For years, you may have associated kindness with unlimited tolerance. You may have confused compassion with self-sacrifice. But individuation corrects that distortion. It doesn't eliminate your empathy, it gives it structure. Now, your kindness is no longer automatic, it is conscious. It is no longer a conditioned reaction driven by the fear of losing connection. It is a choice. You begin to understand that integrating the shadow does not mean becoming dark. It means recognizing that within you, light and firmness coexist, love and discernment, sensitivity and strength. This integration produces something rare, inner coherence. You no longer need to split yourself to maintain relationships. You don't have to hide your perception to be accepted. You don't have to shrink your intensity to fit someone else's expectations. Jung observed that the individuated person develops a kind of stable psychological center. They are not easily pulled by external projections. They do not react automatically to provocation. They do not dissolve in the face of disapproval. This does not mean you become immune to pain. It means you stop fragmenting because of it. Individuation brings emotional maturity. You can love without abandoning yourself. You can forgive without exposing yourself again to the same pattern. You can understand another person without taking responsibility for their shadow. This is the real transformation. It's not about defeating anyone. It's not about proving anything. It's about becoming whole, and a whole person is difficult to manipulate, because they no longer seek outside the validation. They have learned to cultivate within. There is a truth few people are willing to admit. Many don't fear your strength. They fear losing access to the version of you who accepted less than you deserved. When you were tolerant beyond what was healthy, understanding beyond what was reasonable, available beyond what was sustainable, the system worked. There was predictability. There was room for the other person to make mistakes without real consequences. Your ability to forgive quickly created a comfort zone now. What unsettles them isn't your aggression because you haven't become aggressive. What unsettles them is your stability, the absence of desperation. The fact that you no longer react with the same emotional urgency. Clarity is disorienting to those who depended on ambiguity. When you stop negotiating your own boundaries, the other person has to face theirs. When you no longer accept vague justifications, they have to confront the absence of real change. When you refuse to enter the guilt game, the game simply loses its effect. And this is where the attempt to reverse the narrative begins. You're called cold, distant, difficult, dramatic. But look closely. Those accusations often appear precisely when you begin to respect yourself. It's not your transformation that threatens them. It's what it reveals. Your change exposes old patterns. It exposes emotional dependencies. It exposes the comfort that existed while you were taking responsibility for everything. What they lose isn't you, it's control. And control is not love. You didn't become less sensitive. You became more conscious. You didn't become less available. You became selective. You didn't become indifferent. You became whole, and integrity shifts the balance of any relationship that once depended on your fragmentation. If you recognize this shift happening within you, this quiet clarity, this firmness that doesn't need to raise its voice, this boundary that isn't wrapped in guilt, then you have already begun what Jung would call an awakening of consciousness. And this awakening is not external, it's intimate. It is the decision not to abandon yourself again. Let me ask you something directly. When did you realize you could no longer pretend you didn't see? Was it a specific conversation? A pattern that repeated for the last time? Or was it simply the deep exhaustion of betraying yourself just to keep the peace? If something here resonates with your story, leave a comment with the following sentence: I choose not to abandon myself, not as a statement for others, but as an inner commitment to your own integration. This channel exists for those who are willing to face their own shadow, understand the invisible mechanisms of human relationships, and move through the individuation process consciously. If you want to keep deepening this psychological journey, continue watching the next videos. Every topic here is a piece of an internal puzzle that few people have the courage to assemble, because transformation doesn't end when you set boundaries. It begins there, and the more you understand the patterns, the less power they have over you. I'll see you in the shadows of the next hidden truth.